A single red rose was left by the bereaved families today on the spot where the IRA bomb was planted last year. Julian Armstrong, whose parents died in the blast, left a wreath at the War Memorial, and then the families attended a private church service. The carnage at Enniskillen, through words of forgiveness from injured and bereaved, seemed like it might become a turning point. But the story of the town today is also of a reconciliation unfulfilled. Mari Wilson's death led to a voyage of hope to Canada for 6 young people, 3 Protestant, 3 Catholic.
It is the young people who the onus is on, because the older people have set attitudes, and it's too late to change their opinions. Whereas with the young people, they're still impressionable, etc. So it is their opinion can be changed, their beliefs.
Yeah, I agree with Patrick as well, and I think that if this trip carried on, I think it'd be really, really worthwhile.
Perhaps the most telling illumination of Enniskillen today is the fact that the Anglican Bishop of Liverpool, David Shepherd, won't be attending next Sunday's remembrance service at St Macartan's Cathedral. He wouldn't go without his Catholic colleague, Derek Warlock, but he wasn't invited. The Remembrance Day bomb touched a chord right round the world last year, but it's a brutal fact of life in Northern Ireland that in terms of peace or politics, they were just 11 more deaths. Peace depends upon politicians, and while those who died here will always be remembered, as a clergyman once remarked to me, you can't build a peace movement on a single act of terrorism.
Found against Britain by a majority of 12 votes to 7. The British judge was unable to persuade any more of his colleagues that holding somebody for almost 7 days under the anti-terrorism laws was not inconsistent with the suspect's right under the convention to be brought before a judge promptly. It was the Birmingham pub bombings 14 years ago which persuaded the then Labour government to introduce the Prevention of Terrorism Act. This gives the police far-reaching powers. People suspected of involvement in a terrorist offence can be arrested without warrant and detained for up to 48 hours without a court appearance. The detention period can be extended up to 7 days in all with the approval of the Home Secretary or the Scottish or Northern Ireland Secretaries. Dermot COYLE was one of the 4 men who took the government to court. They were detained for periods of between 4 days and nearly a week before all were released without charge.
I thought that the British government had no right to lift an Irishman for 7 days and hold him. I was never ever charged with any political offence.
Well, I think it's very significant in terms of Article 5 of the Convention, because it gives a clear definition of how far the European community is prepared to allow, even in like a terrorist situation, detention, which ends up with the release without charge of an innocent person.
In the Queen's speech last week, the government announced plans to reenact legislation which the European Court has now decided is in breach of a fundamental human right. The Home Secretary is hoping he'll be able to announce next week what the government will do now.
Ryan's arrest is a matter of very grave concern to the government. Mr. Speaker, it's no use governments adopting great declarations and commitments about fighting terrorism if they then lack the resolve to put them into practice.
Attorney General John Murray will eventually give a binding legal judgment on the extradition warrants. Mr Haughey's cabinet feel they've no reason to apologise to London, the affair's being handled correctly. The Labour deputy leader, who's visiting Dublin, was assured by the Foreign Minister that the Irish police know where Father Ryan is hiding.
I did say to the Foreign Minister that while the proper examination of the extradition warrant was being considered, it would be surprising if Father Ryan somehow slipped out of the jurisdiction of the Irish police. And the Foreign Minister very reasonably said it would be very surprising, and that hadn't happened.
So you actually believe that they still know where he is?
I've no doubt they still know where he is.
The Irish government resents the implication from London that Father Ryan was allowed to disappear by the incompetence of the Irish legal authorities. But ministers here in Dublin refuse to be drawn into what they term a slanging match, which can only further unsettle Anglo-Irish relations.
The British were quite prepared to wait 5 months for an answer from the Belgian authorities, but here within 5 days they are precipitating a crisis in Anglo-Irish relations by not allowing the Irish Attorney General to get on with the job.
A defence committee for Father Ryan is gathering support across the Republic. Its basic theme is that the man who was once a Catholic missionary remains a priest dedicated to fundraising for victims of the Irish Troubles. totally innocent of all British allegations. And tonight in Dublin, Father Ryan's brother Joe was at another support meeting, insisting the priest wouldn't receive justice from a British court. The Irish Prime Minister left for Rhodes and a possible meeting with Mrs Thatcher, with the backing even of his political opponents for a vigorous defence of his government's attitude to terrorism. Although Mr Haughey hasn't said so, he shares the view that Mrs Thatcher's comments were deeply offensive. Today, the local newspaper in Father Ryan's home county published a world exclusive. Anne O'Grady, an award-winning reporter, talked with Father Ryan before he slipped away from the Dublin clinic last Monday. She says the priest threatened another hunger and thirst strike if the Irish government allowed extradition proceedings against him. He denied he was an IRA supporter. His job was raising funds for Republican victims of the Northern Ireland Troubles.
He told me he had never been a member of the IRA and never intended to become one, that he had never collected money for arms, and that if money for arms was offered to him, he would refuse it.
Did you put to him some of the British allegations that he was involved in conspiracies to murder, explosives, that sort of thing?
He denied those charges.
Why was he travelling on false passports?
He admitted that he had a false passport. He maintained that this was because he was finding it increasingly difficult in the early 1970s to pass through frontiers, particularly in France. And he said that he had a job to do, and that if he had to travel on a false passport, then he would do so.
This market town in County Tipperary is at the heart of efforts to stop the extradition of Father Patrick Ryan. The newspaper interview was the terrorist suspect's method of addressing that support without coming out of hiding.
Father Ryan's supporters plan a march against extradition in Dublin on Saturday, knowing the Irish Parliament debates the renewal of the extradition arrangements with Britain early next week.
This Anglo-Irish meeting, as so often this year, was about crisis management. Irish Foreign Minister Brian Lenihan and Justice Minister Gerry Collins knew the Patrick Ryan case would dominate Tom King's thinking. Several times in 1988, Mrs Thatcher and Irish Prime Minister Charles Haughey have fundamentally disagreed on major issues. Each time, a subsequent ministerial conference has at least stabilised relations. But not today. Tom King, at a news conference after a 6-hour meeting, did not mince his words on the Patrick Ryan case.
It was, perhaps of all the conferences we've had, an occasion for some pretty blunt speaking. And in particular, I made clear that the claim that if extradited, he would not be able to receive a fair trial was quite unacceptable.
A communiqué revealed Mr King's view that the Irish Attorney General had gone beyond the extradition law in his decision, a significant new problem. The Irish ministers who left for Dublin late this afternoon countered that the Ryan case was unique and wouldn't happen again. Government said tonight it will review extradition, but it's clear the new safeguards that the core of the row are sacrosanct. They're urging Patrick Ryan should be tried in an Irish court and discount his threat of a hunger strike.
They have been waiting at a pre-arranged spot, but the escape plan evidently went wrong when the bombers were challenged. The police now say that sometime between 3 and 3:40 yesterday morning, when the bombs exploded, a hatchback car, possibly a Metro, was seen speeding down the A41 away from the army base. It was spotted by another motorist at roadworks 2 miles from the camp. Today's police news conference also made clear that the IRA bombers had been confronted by 2 sentries, one of whom was threatened at gunpoint and involved in a brief struggle. But what's also clear to the police today is that yesterday's attack must have been planned by a 3-man gang, all of whom then escaped in some disarray. The police won't confirm that 2 of the terrorists may have been the pair who were sought after the discovery of an IRA bomb factory in Clapham last December. The hijacked Montego car, recovered last night, was today under sheets at Shrewsbury Police Station. As the investigation continues, the West Mercia police are anxious to dispel any idea that they haven't responded quickly enough to the bomb attack and its aftermath. They point out that the camp stands in a huge and isolated rural area, and that police numbers were limited in the middle of the night when the attack took place.
Police station in Warren Point, where 16 British soldiers were killed 10 years ago. Its impact killed a young woman shop assistant next door and injured 30 other people. A warning was issued just minutes before the blast.